Thank you very much. All right. Good morning, everyone from Denver, Colorado, and happy local time across the world. Welcome back to another week of the Global Classroom. We're very excited this week to continue considering governance and sustainable development. And we have joining us a very distinguished guest from the Special Advisor on Africa and Special Assistant to the United Nations Secretary General, Ms. Cristina Isabel Lopez de Silva Montero Duarte. Cristina Duarte, thank you so much for joining us.
Pleasure.
Undersecretary General Duarte was appointed as the Special Advisor on Africa back in 2020. Where she brings to the position more than 34 years of leadership and strategic management experience in public policy making and in the private sector, coupled with a deep understanding of international and regional cooperation and the challenges facing African countries. She is a member of the United Nations Committee of Experts on Public Administration and High-Level Advisory Board on Economic and Social Affairs, as well as President Paul Kagame's Advisory Committee on African Union Reforms, the board of the Alliance for a Green Revolution in Africa, and the board of the Institute of African Leadership for Sustainable Development. She served as Minister of Finance, Planning, and Public Administration in the Republic of Cabo Verde from 2006 until 2016. Prior to this position, she was the director of World Bank Project on Private Sector Development and Competitiveness Program. She has also served as Director of Planning and Studies in the Cabo Ministry of Agriculture and Rural Development, and as an advisor to many international financial and non-governmental organizations, including the UNDP, FAO, the African Development Bank, the World Bank, and the IMF. Ms. Duarte joined Citibank in Kenya as manager and financial institution relationships, and rose to become the vice president and country corporate office and head of corporate and investment banking of Citibank in Angola. Ms. Duarte holds a master's in business administration and international management from the American Graduate School of International Management at the Thunderbird School of Global Management, an advanced diploma in business administration from the Economics Institute of the University of Colorado, and a Bachelor of Arts degree in public policies, planning, and development from Lisbon, Portugal. We're very excited to have you join us this morning, Undersecretary General, and we look forward to hearing your talk. And I'll share your slides for you now, and just let me know when you need to switch those.
I don't think, Mark.
Yes. Are you able to see the slides, or are they not sharing? Let me try that.
Another PPT, I believe. Okay, now you are
there we go.
You have the right one.
All right, great.
Yes, yeah. Mark, thank you very much for the opportunity to participate in these global classroom lectures. I think is a very interesting concept. Is a quite efficient way to leverage technology and virtuality. Let's say virtuality to disseminate or to democratize knowledge. Congratulations. Today I'll be presenting, debating the following subjects: understanding the complex relationship between globalization and multilateralism. I strongly believe that we reach a point in the multilateralism system arena that if we do not understand this relationship, we'll not be able to find an exit out of the challenge and problems that we have been facing in the past, I would say, more than 20 years. So slide 2, Mark, please. The following slide. Thank you. So basically, to fully grasp the challenges that global governance face today, as I was saying, is imperative to understand this relationship between globalization and multilateralism. Basically, I can say that these two concepts, they are fundamentally linked. And their interaction basically has led an erosion of the post-World War II governance model. The interaction between globalization and multilateralism. So I propose in this lecture basically to touch in four main ideas. The first, which is an obvious one, understanding the DNA of globalization. Second, exploring why globalization requires the two core functions of multilateralism. Because I'll be saying down the road that in the past 60, 70 years, multilateralism has played essentially two core functions. And we are going to explore why globalization has been requiring both, or needs these two core functions of multilateralism. Third, analyzing how the failure of one of the multilateralism functions eroded World War II global governance model. And the last section, if you allow me, of this presentation is, of course, is a conclusion one, and trying to discuss towards a new governance model. Allow me to start as a pre-note that this is essentially an analytical exercise. Is not a judgment exercise. You are not here to judge. We are here in an open space to analyze from different perspectives, leveraging different exposures in our personal journeys, and trying to understand what is going on around us. Slide 3, understanding the DNA of globalization. So, as we know today, globalization basically is marked or has been informed by three core features that has been defining its scope and influence on global governance. The first one, as I called in my paper, is the perpetuation of globalization. Second feature, the unintended consequence of poverty alleviation. As I will say down the road, poverty alleviation has happened, yes, in the last 40, 50 years, but is essentially a byproduct. And third, the systemic imbalances that globalization generates, and this systemic imbalance, someone has to take care of them. They cannot just be produced without nobody taking care of them. So let's start with the first one, the perpetuation nature of globalization. Everybody knows globalization is not a recent phenomenon. It has been an integral feature of the global economic system, particularly after the World War I, or the First World War. So from an African perspective, and all my presentation will be done from an African perspective because I need to leverage my own personal exposure in the past 50 years. So we can say that the origins of modern globalization can be traced back to the 19th century, early 20th century, with the expansion of the colonial system, and then the neo-colonial system that basically replaced the colonial system after the independence. So basically during after the second World War II. Of course, in this period, in the globalization period, basically powerful nations, and it was the rule of the game, as again, this is not a judgment exercise. Powerful nations expanded their economic space essentially to exploit resources and labor in other regions. This is has been written everywhere. So basically, this economic model, this global economic model, has laid groundwork for a global economy, establishing dependencies that have endured until today. For example, um, African colonization and the later emergence of neocolonial structures illustrates how globalization consistently seeks new markets and resources, shaping economies and societies with a primary focus to feed the perpetuation nature. And after the World War II, we need to acknowledge that this process experienced some acceleration with multilateral institutions, some of them the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, World Trade Organization, emerging essentially to facilitate cooperation with the mandate to stabilize an emerging global economy, because stability is critical to economic expansion, and support, as everybody remembers, reconstruction. However, we need to recognize that these institutions were designed primarily to support economic expansion, not to create an equitable global landscape. And this is the DNA of globalization that we need to understand. So we establish the logical links with multilateralism. The second feature is poverty alleviation as a byproduct. Is not an objective of globalization. So globalization capacity to alleviate poverty has often been seen as a byproduct rather than an objective. In fact, as a mechanism, globalization fosters a cycle of investment, reinvestment driven by pursuit of profit, essentially. So this dynamic promotes economic growth, and the last 40 years have been an amazing period on that, promotes economic growth, and has lifted, indeed, millions out of poverty. This is a fact, this is a reality, particularly in regions that have been integrated in the global economy. Those that have not been integrated have been left out of this poverty reduction. Essentially, the best example is East Asia. However, as I thought, this has not been has been actually an uneven process. And the data from World Bank basically presents the last 40 years as essentially a period of strong wealth concentration, the increase in inequalities, and basically poverty reduction has not been addressed today, until today. Today, as we speak, we have more than 700 million people in extreme poverty, despite the fact the amount of wealth that the system has been able to produce, and one of the drivers have been the technological and innovation paces. The third feature of globalization is imbalances as a systemic outcome, and this is important to understand because this third feature of globalization is linked to one of the core functions of the multilateralism. The first feature was essentially linked to the first function of multilateralism, and the third one to the second function that I will present in a while. So the systemic imbalances created by globalization reflect essentially the absence within globalization robust check and balances, so within the structure. So without adequate regulatory oversight, globalization often perpetuates economic, social, and environment inequalities. This is a subject that has been deeply studied in the academic world. So as I mentioned, wealth concentration has intensified, and with the richest 1% of the global population now owning more wealth than the bottom 50%. So these inequalities, as I like to stress in this lecture, are inherent to globalization's architecture, where the capital flows freely across borders, but regulatory frameworks are limited to national, essentially to national boundaries, particularly from an enforceability standpoint. So creating a gap that multilateral institutions struggle to fill effectively. So in this context, understanding globalization DNA is essential to grasping why multilateralism needed to manage the diverse effects of a system that inherently generates imbalances. So institutions like WTO, IMF, and the World Bank have historically played key roles in shaping globalization. But their frameworks have been often geared towards economic stabilization than rather ratifying the inequalities and environment harm that globalization perpetuates. And despite the achievements of these three multilateral institutions, and their achievements are amazing achievements, WTO, World Bank, and International Monetary Fund, the structural limitations of these institutions often prevent them from addressing the root causes of inequality and environment degradation. And in fact, the historic evolution of globalization, coupled with its tendency to sideline poverty alleviation and amplify systemic balances, underscores the need for a remanaged approach to multilateralism. Once you understand very well the DNA of globalization, we'll be able to better understand the type of rescue, the type of restructuring that the multilateralism needs to address this systemic imbalance. In fact, for global governance to be truly effective, it must move beyond simply facilitating economic expansion. It should do that, but it should go beyond that. Instead, it must incorporate stronger regulatory frameworks and mechanisms of wealth redistribution, environment protection, and social equity. Slide 4, please. Then I move to the second item of this lecture, that is exploring why globalization requires the two core functions of multilateralism. And this is, as I say, quite important. So, as I mentioned, globalization inherent drive for expansion and profit creates a system that, left unchecked, often leads to economic disparities, environment degradation, and social imbalances. So, as globalization continues to reshape economies, societies, and environments, the necessity of multilateralism becomes increasingly evident. So, this is the reason that in this context, globalization requires multilateralism for two essential functions. The first one, I decided to put a more obvious name, paving the way for globalization. And this role involves establishing an international trade system and global value chains as key mechanisms to promote economic integration and interconnectedness. This is the first function, paving the way for globalization. The second function of multilateralism is addressing globalization's imbalances. I call addressing globalization's imbalances functions. And this role, the second function, includes development cooperation and regulatory frameworks to counteract globalization adverse effects, such as inequality, environment degradation, and even market distortion. So these two functions, paving the way for globalization function and addressing globalization's imbalance function, so these two functions are essential for stabilizing an interconnected global system that otherwise lacks the governance structures to balance competing national interests, address transnational challenge, and establishing, let's say, a level playing field. Unfortunately, the reality today is far away from this ideal framework. Slide 5, please. Now let's go a little bit deeper on the first core function of multilateralism, paving the way to globalization function. As I mentioned, essentially International Monetary Fund, World Bank, and World Trade Organization, they have been instrumental in creating the conditions necessary for globalization to thrive. In fact, through policies that everybody knows that champion liberalization, reduction of barriers to trade, and this institution laid the groundwork for a global economic system defined by interdependence and the rapid flow of goods, service, and capital. So the IMF, with its role in stabilizing national economies, has promoted, as everybody knows, financial liberalization, so allowing capital to move freely across borders. And this financial openness enabled multinational corporations to establish a production and supply networks worldwide, thereby accelerating the integration of economies through global value chains. The World Bank will also play a critical role following IMF's financial liberalization. World Bank comes into this journey, this process, basically creating the physical conditions from an infrastructure standpoint to support, to provide content, to provide substance to the financial liberalization. And of course, once you have the financial liberalization, you manage to infrastructure the global arena to put into motion flows, goods, service, and capital. Of course, now you need a third organization to create the rules, to create rules. And then comes the World Trade Organization in fostering globalization. And in fact, it was the most direct, out of the three organizations, was the most direct to play these roles. And it established and enforced the rules of, let's say, global trade. So in sum, these multilateral institutions have created a conducive environment for paved the way to globalization by breaking the barriers to capital flows, promoting financial openness, investing in infrastructure, and establishing trade rules. Through their efforts, World Trade has become a significant driver of economic activity, illustrating the success of these institutions in fulfilling their facilitative, let's say, functions. So we can say that the first function, the paving the way for globalization function, has been efficiently performed. However, globalization has reached new ways. The limitations and challenge of this model has become apparent, revealing the need for a more balanced approach that address social and environment costs, accompanying these economic gains. So now it's clear to everybody we need to balance the game. Slide 6, please. Then comes the second core function of multilateralism, which is related to the need to balance the rules of the game. The second core function of multilateralism is addressing globalization's imbalance. And this second core function of multilateralism has been covering essentially development cooperation and international regulation to address globalization imbalance. Institutions such as United Nations, the European Union's development cooperation programs, these two multilateral entities were designed to take care to manage these imbalances produced by globalization. And in fact, the Millennium Development Goals, the Sustainable Development Goals, and other international and multilateral development cooperation, the main goal is poverty reduction, and the SDGs is much more than that, is to fight back environment degradation, etc., etc. It's clear to everybody that international regulations are critical in a globalized world, where individual nations cannot effectively tackle issues that transcend borders, such as climate change, pandemics, and financial crisis. So international regulations serve to establish norms, standards, and rules that govern the conduct of states and non-state actors in the global arena. You cannot build a globalized world from an economic standpoint, leaving that dimension just unchecked is quite dangerous. So, in the absence of regulatory oversight, globalization often exacerbates inequalities and environmental as market forces prioritize profit over social and ecological, let's say, ecological concerns. So multilateral institutions set the standards that guide global practices, from labor conditions to environment protection. We have the International Labour Organization in the labor conditions arena. We have the COP and the COPs, etc., in the environment degradation arena, trying to set up global standards. When you analyze the effectiveness of these tasks, how these global standards have been done in a certain way that are easily enforceable and they are effective fighting back these two types of degradation is a huge question, let's say question mark. So by understanding why globalization requires the two core functions of multilateralism, interdependence between globalization and multilateralism becomes evident, almost, I would say, almost obvious. So globalization's reach and intensity necessitate a cooperative and regulatory framework that can only be provided through multilateral institutions. Multilateralism. However, as I mentioned, the effectiveness of these institutions, the second core function of multilateral UN system, European Union development cooperation programs, and so on, depends on their ability to adapt to evolving global dynamics and addressing the shortcomings in both cooperation and let's say and regulation. So as the global system becomes more interconnected, the importance of effective multilateralism grows. And this is an important idea. But so too does the need to modernize these frameworks to ensure that can balance economic growth with social equity and environment sustainability. So in summary, globalization requires multilateralism to address globalization imbalance, not only through development cooperation, but also through international regulatory, activity. However, the second function has been significantly less effective than the first one. With growing inequalities, persistent poverty, climate degradation, conflict exacerbation, and even the rise of organized crime being clear indicators that they have not performed well. They have not performed well. Usually, I give the example of my continent, Africa, 21st century, artificial intelligence. There are some entities going to Mars, and my continent still has 600 million people without accessing to electricity. 600 million people in the end of the first quarter of the 21st century. Slide 7. So this moves me to the third item of this presentation. Multilateralism missing balance.
Merci.
The overlooked second function and its consequences. So the global governance model established after World War II was predicated on the assumption that multilateral institutions could provide both a cooperative framework for global economic integration, so the paving the way function, and international regulation and development cooperation mechanisms, the second function addressing globalization's imbalance. But for this model to result, the two functions, the space of each of these two functions need to be preserved. The first function cannot crowd out the second one, and the second function cannot crowd out the first function. Because the first function produces imbalances, economic expansion function, let's say this way, and it's critical for the multilateralism to take care of the imbalances. But the multilateralism needs economic expansion to create wealth, so wealth can be redistributed and fight back poverty. So the space of each of these two functions needs to be preserved. However, over time, the first function, the paving the way function to globalization, the economic expansion almost without limits, without boundaries, facilitating globalization, has increasingly overshadowed the second one, addressing globalization's imbalance. And in reality, we witness the first function crowding the first function crowding out the second one, leading to a series of structural weaknesses within multilateralism, resulting in regulatory deficits, lack of accountability, inefficiencies, and a profound erosion of trust in international institutions. So basically, the crowding out of the second function by the first one is reflecting in a set of weaknesses that exists today in the global arena. Slide 8, please. And I'll be very quickly, then I can respond to questions. The first one is the regulatory deficit. So the prioritization of economic liberalization and globalization over regulatory oversight has led to what can be described as a regulatory deficit. And this gap has enabled vested interests, particularly large corporations, to consolidate power and exploit loopholes. So globalization regulatory framework has failed to keep pace with the growing complexities of global finance, allowing for threats like tax evasion, for example, profit shifting, etc., etc. So this is the first, let's say, the first weakness, basically the first weakness. Just to provide you a number, according to the Tax Justice Network, the global economy, not only African countries, but the global economy loses $427 billion in taxes each year to international corporate tax abuse and private tax evasion. This is money that is directly taken from the second core function that could finance the second core function and, of course, finance the Sustainable Development Goals agenda that, as everybody knows, we are completely off track. The second weakness is the absence of global political leadership and accountability. This is another structural weakness of the crowding out effect, is the absence of global political leadership and accountability. So multilateral institutions often lack the mechanisms needed to hold powerful nations and corporations accountable for their actions. And I do believe that the 2008 financial crisis is a good example. Exposed the inability of multilateralism to manage the imbalances in the global financial system effectively. As everybody knows, the crisis caused in part by unregulated financial markets highlight the lack of global oversight in areas critical to economic stability. Because without economic stability, no economic expansion. And without economic expansion, we are eating the nature of globalization. So, and becomes a sort of vicious cycle. The third one is the inefficiency of multilateral process. So the inefficiency of multilateral process further compounds these issues. Multilateral organizations are often hampered by bureaucratic inertia and complex decision-making process, which prevent them, or which has been preventing them from adapting to emerging challenges. The best example is climate change. So while climate change poses an existential threat, the slow pace of international negotiations had led to incremental and insufficient progress, and also is a part of the multilateralism that has been very difficult to enforce. Let's say to enforce the decisions, despite the fact that we all face, let's say, an existential threat. The last one is a rise of alternative governance model. As multilateralism struggles, alternative governance models have emerged in the form of regional and bilateral agreements. Since the 2000s, there has been a notable rise in regional trade agreements, bilateral treaties, reflecting a shift in power in this structure. So, according to WTO, the number of regional trade agreements in force increased from 100 in 2000 to 300 in 2022. Of course, these agreements offer more flexible frameworks for cooperation and often bypass the complexities of multilateral organizations. So the cumulative effect of these weaknesses, we can say even failures, has been an erosion of trust in the global governance model established after the World War II. This brings me to slide 9. Moving forward. So moving forward requires rescuing the second function of multilateralism. And the paradox that globalization has reached a point that if we do not rescue the second function of multilateralism, this second function will not be able to provide economic stability for globalization to keep enjoying economic expansion. And this is a quite historical and interesting paradox. So rescuing the addressing globalization's imbalance functions of multilateralism is essential to rebuild the global governance, restore trust in international institutions, and achieve the 2030 agenda and the 2063 agenda. So the erosion of regulatory capacity has left multilateralism vulnerable, leading to widespread disillusion of its ability to manage the negative impacts of globalization. But for multilateralism to regain its relevance and legitimacy and be in a position to start playing the addressing globalization's imbalance functions, provide social and economic stability to globalization, a transformative approach is required. One that balances economic integration, regulatory oversight, and wealth distribution to ensure social equity and environment sustainability. And this, therefore, calls for a reinvigorated commitment to 3 key principles. The first, acknowledge the emergence of a new economic world. Otherwise, conflict will not be addressed. Second, building a win-win transition. It's possible. Third, reintroducing accountability in global, let's say, global leadership. And of course, I believe that these are quite obvious. Acknowledging a new economic order is a sort of the first step in rescuing the multilateralism's second function in its dual dimension, regulatory and development cooperation, to acknowledge the emergence of this new international economic order. Building a win-win transition, so for multilateralism to regain its role in regulating globalization, the transition to a new global economic must be framed as a win-win scenario. Historically, shifts in global power dynamics have often been perceived as a zero-sum game, fostering tensions and resistance, particularly between the global north and the global south. However, the transition offers an opportunity to redefine globalization as a mutually beneficial process. So far, some epicenter countries held a dominant position in the global governance. Must approach this shift not as a threat, at all, but as an historical step that has become a sort of inevitable, let's say, in this way. And the third one is reintroducing accountability in leadership. So And perhaps this is the most crucial pillar for rescuing the second function of multilateralism, which is the reintroduction of accountability in global leadership. Over the past decades, global governance has increasingly been criticized for its lack of transparency and accountability, leading to a disconnect between decision makers and the population affected by their policies. So, for multilateral institutions to regain public trust, there must be a concerted effort to implement new global rules that ensure both economic equity and environment sustainability. And this accountability must extend not only to nation states, but to all, let's say, to all stakeholders. Of course, to achieve these goals, multilateral institutions must prioritize the creation of enforceable, transparent mechanisms that foster genuine accountability. Slide 10, and I'll be very brief. Slide 10, I did more to answer questions regarding the UN system. Basically, the reforms led by the Secretary General and the Deputy Secretary General are a call to action. And I'm referring to the UN 2.0 as a framework for reform that, among others, will position the UN system the best entity to rescue the second function of the let's say of the multilateral arena. So and by doing that, we need to combine a long-term vision for structural reforms, but we need at the same time identify short-term actions that can restore balance. And for that, I do believe that the UN system has been already working in this direction. The first is the new conceptual framework, Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs. I hope everybody has noticed, represent a fundamental shift from traditional development thinking. So unlike previous frameworks, development frameworks, which basically do not combine these three dimensions, the SDGs combine economic, social, and environment goals, meaning that the SDGs combine economic expansion, economic stability, and environment protection. Second, the SDGs is a framework that, in order to be delivered, requires collaboration, not competition. In fact, competition will undermine the delivery of this important framework. The second one is the Secretary General's reform to support this transition. So the UN Secretary has introduced a reform package that aligns with the shift in development thinking exemplified by the SDGs. We create, or a new framework has been created in 2015, a more holistic one, calls for different values and principles. Of course, now the machine needs to be reformed to be able to deliver that new development thinking, let's say, framework. And the third is the UN 2.0, as I say, is the chair on top for a stronger multilateral system, where basic innovation data are the drivers of in terms of reshaping, restructuring old business model. And this is the value proposition in special, in particularly to African states and to African policy, let's say, policymakers. So the multilateral systems, and we move to slide 11, the last one, towards a new vision for global governance. So the multilateral system, as it stands, face a profound crisis of credibility and effectiveness. So the imbalance between the two core functions of multilateralism, the facilitation of globalization and the management of its resulting disparities, has skewed global governance in favor of economic expansion, while neglecting the crucial role of regulatory oversight and wealth distribution. So the new vision for global governance needs to acknowledge that these two dimensions needs to be together and needs to be delivered at the same level of importance. One cannot crowd the second one, and the second one cannot crowd out the first one. And I stop here. Back to you, Mark. Thank you for the opportunity.
Great, thank you so much for the overview. We do have a lot of questions in the chat. Oops, there we go. All right, our first question comes to us from our colleagues in Madagascar. Juan Baptiste, are you able to pose your question?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Can you hear me? Oh, okay. I do apologize if my question is not directly related to the topic, but the African intellectual or political leaders have a big problem to resolve poverty. So they think that the problem is from globalization or from donors or from external pressure. So I would like to know your opinion about that. Thank you.
May I, Mark?
Yes, please.
I will take more questions. Sorry, I don't know the methodology.
Oh, yeah. However you would like to proceed, we can do one question at a time, or we could ask more. Yeah.
Okay. Actually, your question, Jean-Baptiste, is completely, fully related to the subjects of this lecture. Completely. It's not out of the picture at all. We need to understand that Africa's situation today is a result of external factors and internal factors. So when you put African elite, African intellectual or political elite versus external pressure, now both. And allow me very quickly to provide you with a couple of facts and ideas that I believe are important to understand these internal versus external factors. Africa, as everybody knows, have been a stage for geopolitical competition. Everybody. Is the colonial model, is the neo-colonial model, etc. But at the same time, after the independence, the new African leadership that emerged basically were completely unable to deliver the independence. Because the state that they inherit was a state that usually play essentially two functions. Resource extraction and rule of the law. And this profile of state, or this profile of the states inheriting after independence, was not the one required to implement the independence. And they failed. Then comes their failure has been, let's say, blamed to the fact that the states had no profile to deliver development, and after we know the story. But at the end of the day, what we need is to understand that policymaking in Africa has been focused on managing poverty and not manage development in a rich country, which is a paradox. So we need to address that this paradox, shifting our mindsets of managing poverty to managing development. And I do believe by doing so, we start tackling the internal factors. And when tackling the internal factors, we'll be able to deal with the external ones. Because by tackling the internal factors, we'll be able to enjoy higher levels of ownership, namely over economic and financial flows.
Great, thank you so much for the response. Our next question comes from Julie Wright. Julie, are you on the line?
Hi, my name is Julie, and I'm a junior at Lehigh University studying community health. And my question is, in the relationship between nation-state system, democratic politics, and economic trade, is there one of those that should be prioritized over the others given their relationship to better meet the SDGs?
You identify three issues: nation-state systems, democratic politics, and economic trade. From an analytical standpoint, these are three issues. But Juliet, from a reality standpoint, you are just mentioning one reality. And I will give you an example on debt in Africa. Africa is in debt distress, everybody knows. Everybody has been saying that Africa is in debt distress because it's over in debt. It's not true. Africa is in debt distress because Africa does not control their economic and financial flows, loses on an annual basis $500 billion, which is a float, not a stock. And how come Africa loses $500 billion is related to the international trade system that keeps Africa at the bottom of global value chains. This debt distress and keeping Africa at the bottom of global value chains basically feeds weak states, weak country systems, and weak institutions, making African states in a position almost impossible to deliver development, social service, and let's say public goods. This has been feeding marginalization and grievance, which means feeding instability and conflict. And of course, democratic politics without a state that is financially strong to deliver social service and public goods means that that democratic regime is not in a position to deliver economic democracy. You need to tackle all of that. You need to tackle.
Great. Thanks again. Heidi, are you on the line?
Thank you. My name is Heidi Klein, and I'm a master's student studying environmental policy at Lehigh University. And I'm wondering, what role do you think South-South partnerships can play in helping Africa achieve greater economic sovereignty and kind of rebalancing the imbalances of globalization overall?
Thank you. I just had the opportunity in an interview a couple of days ago to respond to a question about South-South cooperation within the Global South. The Global South or South cooperation, they face a dilemma. And the dilemma is a very simple one. If the South-South cooperation will just replicate the international cooperation model that emerged after the Second World War II, essentially driven by a neocolonial configuration, then global South-South will fail. If the South-South cooperation understands in process the historical dynamics that now are visible to everybody, and by understanding these historical dynamics, emerging a new power centers in the geopolitical arena, and understands that model is over, and they need to create a new one that moves from a zero-sum game to a win-win, as I mentioned in my presentation, then South-South cooperation will deliver for Africa.
All right, for our next question, we go to Ecuador. Enith, are you on the line?
Yes, I'm here. Thank you. Thank you. Well, I have this question in relation to the global challenges we face today, such as climate change, inequality, and public health crisis, that the role of multilateral institutions has never been more critical, as you said. So you highlight the need for a reformed multilateral system that not only facilitates globalization, but also manages its disparities. So how do you envision the integration of the sustainable development goals in the reform of multilateral institution in this reformed multilateral system? Thank you.
Thank you, Annie. Thank you very much. Any reform process, let's start not any reform process, multilateral. I just undertook a reform process of the department that I'm in. Any reform process to succeed needs to be driven by a vision. If you don't have a vision, you will not be able to implement a reform process that will deliver value and impact. So when talking about reforming multilateral institutions, the SDGs are the vision that needs to drive the reform process of the multilateral institutions. So they are the same coins, they are the two sides of the same coin. The multilateral institutions reform process needs to be driven by a vision. And the Sustainable Development Goals are that vision. As I said, holistic for the first time, a shift in development thinking, putting together economic expansion, but social equity.
Great, thank you again. And thanks for your question from Ecuador, Enith. Now moving to Dublin. To Dublin, we have Stacia with the question. Stacia? All right, Stacia may not be currently on the line. Stacia, are you on the line?
Sorry, I just muted. Sorry.
Great. All right, we've got you.
Oh, thank you. This is Stacia from UCD, and I would like to ask how can Africa shine its uniqueness and enhance the bargaining or disclose power, and what is the current status of Africa progressing to multilateralism? Thank you.
I used to say that we reach a point, Africans and African policymakers, we reach a point
Yes.
where the global dynamic, the global historical dynamics are creating an opportunity for Africa to reposition itself in the global geopolitical. For that to happen, the change should come from inside. For that to happen, the change should come from our own mindsets. What I mean by that, we need to understand, and it goes back what I said, I believe, in the first question. We need to move from managing poverty to manage development. We cannot continue being captured by a financial paradox where with our right hand we lose $500 billion, and we are with our left hand we are in debt distress and beg for ODA. It's not possible. It's not possible. So to rethink, as you said in your comment, for Africa to shine its weakness and progress in the sense of reposition itself in the multilateral system, we need to address our own contradictions. We need to tackle our own paradoxes and then try to grab the opportunity of the historical moment in the geopolitical arena.
Thank you. And a couple of questions coming up next on China and Africa. The first from Connor. Connor, are you on the line?
Yeah, I'm on the line. Hi, my name's Connor. I'm a master's student at Lehigh University studying environmental policy. And I was just wondering, considering the non-aligned movement, which is very popular in Africa, what role do you think nations in Africa will play in the ever-growing antagonism between the US and China? And I also want to know if you think that they can kind of play on that antagonism to help their development.
I do believe that, again, we reach a time, Africa reach a time that it needs to look essentially inside for their own solutions. The geopolitical dynamics have been forever. Now is West China, 100 years was this industrial revolution or another big countries. These are the rules of the game. We cannot always be in the waiting room, waiting for the outcome of these rules to take a position. We can't. I think it's time for Africa to understand that Africa has all the conditions inside, financial, because if you lose $500 billion and you are already financing your own development in more than 75%, you do have conditions to start building a sustainable financing process to deliver sustainable development. And this should be the driver and position Africa as a global player, because Africa is entitled to, as a global player in the geopolitical arena with other actors. We need to move out of the waiting room, definitely. We need to move out of the waiting room.
Okay, and another question related to Africa and China. Blaise, are you on the line?
Hello, I'm Blaise. I'm a junior at Lehigh. I'm studying computer science and urban planning. So as we read in one of the readings, China's Belt Road Initiative has created a lot of development in Africa, and this is inherently better than past colonialism for a lot of reasons, but there's still a lot of concerns due to quality of infrastructure, environmental concerns, the nature of labor, and that this might just be furthering the impacts of colonialism. So do you think that this is healthy development that China is investing in, and does it exemplify the second function of multilateralism?
As I said in my presentation, everybody knows that globalization, the global economy and the globalization has not served wealth distribution, has not served social equality, has not served poverty reduction. 700 million. With the high level of technological control, with the amount of wealth that the world has been able to create in the past 40 years, to have 700 million people in poverty, it's a clear indication. This is an old model, and that old model has been the actors. We need all to understand, and this is my response to the South-South cooperation. We need all to understand, and what I said in my lecture, we need to move from a zero-sum game to a win-win situation. Now, maybe 30 years ago, that would only benefit maybe developing countries, because the others were just driving the surf, were just surfing the big wave of wealth concentration. But now we reach a point where conflictuality, instability is undermining everybody. So it's the time to stop, think, reset, and reset. And this is my position. Africa is getting ready to exercise its entitlement role to any actor in the world,
Thank you so much. Gary, are you on the line?
Yeah, thank you, Mark. Ms. Duarte, thank you for your presentation today. I'm currently a master's student at University College Dublin. I think to help realize a sustainable future, investing in the people of a country can really help identify and overcome the root causes of not realizing the SDGs. Would love to get your thoughts on perhaps fostering human capital development and the most effective vehicles to promote knowledge sharing, skills development, as well as labor mobility across African countries?
Yes, thank you for your question, Gary. We have been advocating that the last 50 years, strong economic growth has been delivered, and despite that, very few social development. What was the missing piece? What was the missing piece in the model that was on our tables in the past 6 years? The missing piece was people-centered policy. This is the missing piece. If you do not adopt for the next 60 years people-centered policy, and this will require the rescue of the second function of multilateralism to take care of the imbalances coming from globalization. If you do not do that, we reach a situation where instability will be undermining, as I said, economic stability and undermining globalization. So we have an historical opportunity when maybe for the first time, putting people-centered policies in the driver's seat is a win-win-win-win situation for Africa, for multinationals, for developed countries, for emerging countries. Because if you don't do that, in a silent way, we might be undermining the global economic system.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you for that response. Next, we go back to Ecuador. Wilson Goyas, are you on the line?
Yes, please. We're on the other side of the world, so the question is what type of regional leadership is necessary to strengthen multilateral cooperation in Latin America, addresses global challenges like migration, drugs, trafficking, and crime, something like that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. There is a basic principle when addressing the effectiveness and efficiency of multilateralism. It's a very simple principle. We cannot build strong multilateral systems with weak states. It does not work. It does not work. Because multilateral systems are not procedures, are not rules, are not processes, are not resolutions. No. Multilateral systems, the pillars of strong multilateral systems are strong states. And you see, and the quite good number of strong states is the guarantor of an effective multilateral system. So what happened is that in the past 60 years, the multilateral system was essentially epicenter in a couple of developed countries. But then all the states are emerging to become economic powers, which means strong states. The multilateral system needs to process that reality. Otherwise, we'll be shooting its own foot. And this is
okay.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you, Mark.
Thank you for your question. And we have time for just one more question.
Yes,
Amber.
because I have someone waiting for me in another meeting. My apologies, Mark.
No, you're fine. Do you have time to answer this last question, or should we adjourn?
Which one?
Amber asks if a unified African multilateral framework could reshape the continent's economic and development future free from Western or Chinese control.
We do have a strong multilateral framework. We do have. Is the Agenda 2063. So the challenge is not a lack of a vision in Africa. We have a strong vision. And to design that strong vision, of course, we had to go through an exercise of identifying the gaps, the weakness, the challenges. We did. The exercise is done. The question is, how come that vision has been facing so many drawbacks and challenges when trying to implement it. We need to understand the missing piece. If we compare Agenda 2063, the vision in that agenda, and we compare again, I go back to one of the ideas that I present in this lecture, and we compare with the profile of African states, most of them, there is a huge gap. A state with weak country systems, weak institutions. I will give you an example. A state, and I will not give you the name, a state that loses millions of dollars in trade mispricing is a state ready to implement Agenda 2063? No. Because to implement Agenda 63, we need to put people-centered. You need to adopt in a massive way people-centered policies. People-centered should be, as I said, in the driver's seat. So you need to build your own sustainability from a financing standpoint. And in order to do that, you cannot lose millions of dollars of trade mispricing because you have weak country system. So this is the gap that we need to address between Agenda 2063 is a people-centered policy agenda, clearly, and what is the profile of African states to deliver that agenda. And realize that the missing piece are strong country systems, strong institutions, made in Africa policy frameworks to deliver that. And I stop here, Mark. I'm sorry, I need to move on. My apologies.
Yes. No, we thank you so much. We know you're very busy. We very much appreciate your time, Undersecretary General. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. It's been a pleasure, Mark.
Great. We appreciate it.
Bye to participants.
Bye-bye. And for everyone else, we'll see you again next week, where the topic will be global food security with Professor Glenn Denning. Thank you so much, everybody. Have a happy local time and see you next week.